Harrow's Point sleeps beneath the waves, but the shadows never do. A cursed lighthouse, a shard that binds restless spirits, and one guardian forced to stand against a darkness that is patient, eternal, and waiting. In this town, curiosity kills, and some shadows never rest. The wind clawed at the shore long before anyone in Harrow's Point realized the sea was wrong. The gulls had stopped screaming a week before the first body surfaced, and the waves had begun to roll in with a color that no one could name, gray with a pulse, like something half alive. For most of the residents, the strangeness was just another quirk of living on the coast. But for Elias Ward, who had spent his entire life listening to the tides, it was a warning he couldn't ignore. Elias had inherited the lighthouse from his father, and his father from his grandfather, each man bound to the light that watched over the treacherous cliffs. He lived alone now, in a weather-beaten house where salt crusted every windowpane and the floors whispered underfoot at night. The town below, what was left of it, had dwindled to a few dozen families, their faces lined by wind and loss. Harrow's Point had been dying for years, but lately, the rot had spread faster. Boats returned half-empty, fish floated belly up in the harbor, and people spoke of shadows moving beneath the water, too large, too human. It began, Elias would later think, the night he found the jar. He'd been walking the shoreline after midnight, flashlight beam trembling over slick stones and seaweed. The fog rolled thick, heavy as smoke, muting the world into a kind of gray blindness. That was when his boot struck glass. A jar, half buried in sand, sealed with black wax. Inside it floated a scrap of cloth and something darker, a human tooth. He might have left it there, but something about the wax mark caught his attention. 16 lines carved in a circle, forming a shape like a sun collapsing inward. It was the same symbol his father used to scratch into the wood whenever he spoke of the dead of the light, though he never explained what it meant. Elias pried the wax loose. The sea answered. It began as a sigh, deep and low, then rose into a scream that seemed to come from beneath the waves. His flashlight flickered out. The tide surged, sudden and violent, pulling at his legs as if alive. Elias stumbled back, clutching the jar, and something cold brushed his ankle. Fingers impossibly long. He ran all the way to the lighthouse, breath tearing through him, heart hammering like a drum of nails. When he slammed the door shut, he realized his hands were bleeding. The jar had shattered in his grip. The scrap of cloth was gone. For 3 nights afterward, the fog never lifted, and each dawn, Elias found new footprints in the sand outside the lighthouse, bare, wet, and leading from the sea to his door. The town began to unravel soon after. Old Mrs. Coyle's son vanished while checking the lobster traps. A week later, his body washed up, bloated and pale, his eyes black with something that writhed beneath the surface. Then the dogs started howling at nothing. The priest refused to bless the graves anymore, muttering that the dead wouldn't stay buried. The sheriff tried to keep order, but when his deputy drowned himself in the harbor, no one listened to him again. Through it all, Elias felt the pull of the lighthouse, a whisper rising from the waves each night, calling him by name. He tried to ignore it, but sleep offered no escape. He dreamed of the sea spilling through his windows, of 16 shadows standing around his bed, their faces empty hollows. One evening, a knock came at the door. It was Clara Hensley, the town's last historian, a woman with storm-colored eyes and hands that trembled from too many sleepless nights. She carried a book wrapped in oilcloth. "You found it, didn't you?" she asked, voice raw. "The 16th vessel." Elias hesitated, but she didn't wait for an answer. She stepped inside, closed the door, and unwrapped the book. It wasn't paper, but thin sheets of lead, etched with words that shimmered like water. "The curse was written before the town existed," she said. 16 vessels for 16 shadows, each one buried to bind what the sea wanted back. Your family was the first to keep watch over the seals, to make sure none were broken. Elias stared at her. "And if they are?" She looked toward the window where the fog pressed like flesh. "Then Harrow's Point returns to the tide." That night, Elias stood at the top of the lighthouse, watching the light spin over the dark water. For a moment he thought he saw them, the shadows, rising in the surf, their shapes flickering just beyond the beam. He counted them, 1, 2, 3, 15. And then he felt the 16th behind him. It spoke without sound, a voice in his blood. "You broke the seal." Elias turned slowly. What stood there was his own reflection, soaked, grinning, eyes hollow. Its hand rose, dripping black water, and pressed against his chest. The cold rushed in like drowning. He fell. Or perhaps the world tilted. The light shattered. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was the sea, surging up the cliffs as if it meant to swallow the town whole. When he woke, it was daylight. The lighthouse stood silent. The air reeked of salt and decay. Down below, the town was gone. Only rooftops visible above the flood. Bodies drifted in the shallows. And in the sand where he'd first found the jar, 15 others now lay uncovered, their wax seals broken. Elias screamed until his throat bled, but the sea only whispered back, patient and endless. Elias staggered down the cliffside path, the roar of the sea chasing him. Every step sank into wet sand that pulsed like a living thing. The air was thick with mist and rot. He could taste iron on his tongue. Down where the town should have been, only the tops of buildings broke the surface, roofs glistening like the shells of drowned creatures. He called out, hoarse and frantic, but the fog swallowed his voice whole. He moved toward what had once been Main Street. Waves lapped against the post office, the market, the church. He could see shadows moving beneath the water, slow, graceful, human in outline. When one surfaced beside him, it was Clara, or what was left of her. Her skin gleamed like glass, her eyes filled with the gray of the sea. She opened her mouth, and water spilled out instead of words. Elias stumbled backward, nearly falling. "Clara, what happened?" he shouted. But she only raised her hand, pointing toward the horizon. Out there, beyond the ruined docks, something vast moved beneath the waves, a shape too large to comprehend. The water bulged and heaved as though the sea itself were breathing. Elias fell to his knees. "What are you?" he whispered. Clara's voice came then, but it wasn't hers anymore. It was every drowned soul speaking through her. "The debt of the light. The 16th vessel has broken. The sea will take what was stolen." He remembered his father's warnings, the old mutterings about keeping the lamps lit, about how the light didn't just guide ships. It held something back. Every generation had been a guardian, and he had failed them. Elias ran. Not toward safety, there was none, but toward the lighthouse. His boots splashed through ankle-deep water that grew deeper with every step. By the time he reached the base of the cliff, the ocean was at his waist. The climb nearly killed him. Rocks tore his hands open, but the pain was distant, unimportant. Inside, the lighthouse was filled with whispers. The walls dripped, the floorboards groaned as though the building itself were breathing. He could hear footsteps on the stairs above, slow and deliberate. He climbed anyway, each step heavier than the last. At the top, the lantern room was dark. The glass panes were streaked with salt, and the great light stood dead, its lens fractured. Beside it waited his reflection. He 16th Shadow. It smiled with his mouth. "You kept me waiting," it said, voice a perfect echo. Elias backed away. "What do you want?" "What I am owed." The shadow's form rippled, skin turning to liquid, features sliding away. "Your blood broke the seal. Your breath called me back. I am the memory of every drowned soul this town ever fed to the sea." Lightning flared through the fog outside, painting the room in white. For a moment, Elias saw more shapes gathering below. 15 others, standing in the surf, their faces empty hollows. He grabbed the rusted lantern pole beside him and swung it through the reflection. It struck air, then resistance, a shriek that rattled the glass. The reflection exploded into spray, drenching him in icy brine. For a heartbeat he thought he'd won. Then the sea answered again. The lighthouse shook. Cracks split the walls. From below came a sound like 1,000 doors slamming open underwater. Elias looked down and saw black water rising up the stairwell, climbing like a living tide. He fled upward, though there was nowhere left to go. The light's metal frame groaned as the sea forced its way through the door below. He lit the emergency flare, its red glow slicing through the gloom, and held it high. "You want me?" he shouted. "Take me then." The reflection reformed before him, its eyes bright as the flare's heart. "I already have." The floor gave way. Elias fell through darkness, through water, through something colder than death. When he hit the ground, there was no pain, just stillness. He opened his eyes to find himself standing on the ocean floor. The town of Harrow's Point was there too, silent beneath the waves. Figures drifted between the ruins, their faces pale moons. Clara was among them, holding the lead-bound book, its pages fluttering despite the water. She looked at him, sorrow in her hollow gaze. "There's still one way," she said, though her mouth didn't move. "Seal it again. 16 vessels for 16 souls. A guardian must bind himself to the light." Elias understood. The debt his family had kept for generations wasn't just about watching, it was sacrifice. Each keeper had given part of themselves to keep the curse contained. He was the last, and the sea wanted him whole. He reached out, taking the book, the metal burned cold in his hands. "Then let it end with me." He opened the pages, the words inside shifting like waves. The water around him began to churn. One by one the shadows turned toward him, their mouths opening in silent screams. Elias began to speak the words etched in the lead, his voice breaking through the water like thunder. The ocean convulsed. The drowned buildings trembled. The shadow that wore his face shrieked, tearing itself apart in ribbons of black foam. But the price came swiftly. The water boiled with light, searing through his body, filling his lungs with salt and fire. His veins burned as the sea carved its mark into him. 16 lines spiraling inward, the symbol of the broken seal. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the lighthouse above, shining once more, its beam cutting through the storm. The water receded. The sea fell silent. When morning came, the waves were calm again. The town was gone, swallowed whole, leaving only the lighthouse on its cliff. Inside, at the lantern's base, stood a glass jar sealed with black wax. Inside it floated a single drop of blood and a human tooth. 16 lines carved into the seal formed a sun collapsing inward, and in the reflection of the glass, a face watched. Elias's face, smiling faintly, waiting for the next fool to break the seal. The lighthouse stood alone, its beam cutting across the calm sea, a beacon to no one. The wind whispered through the cracks in the stone, carrying the faint tang of salt and decay, as if the ocean itself exhaled through the ruins. Harrow's Point had vanished beneath the waves, leaving only the skeletal remnants of its streets hidden beneath. A glassy surface, yet the curse lingered, patient, waiting. Inside, the jar pulsed faintly with black light. No one dared approach it, and yet the air around it shimmered, the temperature dropping whenever a shadow passed. Elias's face reflected in the glass, smiling faintly, a warning frozen in time. Though he was gone, a fragment of him remained bound to the seal, the 16th guardian, the final keeper of a debt he had accepted too late. Years passed in silence. Sailors whispered of a lone lighthouse on a deserted coast, its beam burning through fog so thick it seemed almost alive. They spoke of shadows rising from the water, of figures that walked just beneath the waves, and of screams carried on the wind that no living ear could bear. But no one came close, and the world moved on, leaving Harrow's Point and its lighthouse to its slow, eternal decay. Yet the curse was patient. It bided its time, waiting for the first fool to touch the jar again. In the shadows, the echoes of the past lingered. 15 other shadows, guardians who had failed, trapped between the tides and the sky, their eyes hollow, waiting. Elias's blood still marked the waxed seal. His sacrifice had held the sea at bay, but only barely. Then came the storm. It began quietly, a tremor in the wind, a subtle shift in the tide. Birds vanished from the sky. The fog thickened, rolling inland like smoke from 1,000 drowned fires. Night came early, though the sun had barely passed its zenith. And when the first lightning struck the cliffs, it illuminated a figure standing at the water's edge. A girl, or what looked like a girl, clothed in seaweed and tattered linen, eyes black as ink, skin glimmering with brine. She reached for the lighthouse, her hands long and slender, fingertips dripping with salt water. The waves parted at her approach, forming a path that no living thing should tread. She raised her head and sang, a voice both human and not, the melody vibrating in the bones of anyone within miles. The jar quivered. The shadows beneath the waves stirred, 15 forms rising, breaking the surface with a quiet violence. They circled the lighthouse, silent and patient, as though rehearsing a ritual older than memory. The sea swelled with their intent, water boiling and churning, and a low moan rose from its depths. Inside the lantern room, the wind carried a familiar whisper, one that Elias had heard before his death. The debt has been broken. Though the jar remained sealed, the seal itself was weakening. The black wax cracked, tiny fissures spreading like veins. A single drop of brine leaked from one crack, sliding down the jar, carrying the scent of the drowned town with it. It was enough. The girl stepped closer. From her mouth fell a scrap of cloth identical to the one Elias had found years before. In an instant, the jar shattered, the wax exploding in shards of black light. The shadows erupted from the water in violent arcs, their forms writhing and twisting, faces screaming silently. The sea rose, surging through the lighthouse, ripping doors from their hinges and shattering windows with the force of centuries of pent-up fury. The girl, the 16th Shadow reborn, advanced, her eyes locking on the air where Elias's reflection had once been. Though he was gone, his presence lingered in the room, and the shadow recognized it, sensing the guardian's absence. The scream of the town's dead echoed through her, a chorus of rage and despair. Below, the waves broke over the cliffs, carrying debris from the submerged town. Roofs, boats, trees, fragments of human memory swirled together, forming grotesque shapes in the storm-tossed waters. The lighthouse trembled under the onslaught, its beam flickering like a dying heartbeat. And then silence fell. The storm subsided as if the ocean itself had paused to take a breath. The girl vanished, leaving behind only the shattered jar, fragments of black wax and a faint trail of brine. The shadows sank beneath the waves once more, 15 waiting, patient, eternal. The lighthouse remained, standing against time and tide, but the curse had awakened. Somewhere, far away from the coast, a traveler would stumble upon a black swirled jar half buried in sand, unaware of the debt it carried. And once touched, the cycle would begin anew. Harrow's Point slept beneath the waves, but the sea never forgot. Long before Elias Ward, before the town had a name, before the first lighthouse rose on the cliffs, the sea had its own memory. It remembered every life taken, every secret buried beneath the waves. Legends told of a time when the coastal tribes called it the Hollow Tide, a being of hunger and will, craving balance. To appease it, the first guardians had been chosen, not by blood, but by fate. They carried vessels, jars like the one now resting in the shattered lighthouse, each containing a fragment of the sea's own vengeance, bound with wax marked by 16 lines. Each guardian gave a piece of themselves, a sacrifice in flesh or spirit. And for generations, the debt held. But human will is weak. Pride, fear, and curiosity always seep through the cracks. One by one, the guardians failed. Some vanished without a trace, swept into the ocean by storms they had unwittingly summoned. Others returned broken, their minds fraying, leaving only husks to take up the mantle. The shadows they had contained did not die. They lingered beneath the waves, patient, waiting for a moment of weakness. Elias had been no exception. The first time he touched the jar, he did not understand its history. He had not known the true weight of the light, or the lives it had consumed in service. He'd broken the seal, and the 16th Shadow had returned. The sea had claimed Harrow's Point as punishment, and he had been consumed, leaving only the faint imprint of his presence, a warning to the next unwitting keeper. Time passed. Generations blurred. The lighthouse stood, abandoned to storms and salt, a relic and a warning. The jar remained, imperceptibly pulsing, and the shadows, 15 in number, waited beneath the surface, invisible to the untrained eye. Then the wind shifted, carrying a smell of brine and decay inland, stirring the memories of those sensitive to it. Fishermen whispered of nets snagged on unseen hands, of lights on the water that weren't stars, of shapes moving beneath their boats. Children on the cliffs claimed to see a girl walking along the edge, hair dripping wet, eyes black as the storm-tossed sea. None dared approach, and most told themselves it was imagination, the product of fear and isolation. But the curse does not care for reason. It was on a night when the moon hid behind thick clouds that the girl returned to the lighthouse. The storm that followed was unlike any recorded in living memory. Winds that tore roofs from buildings, waves that clawed at cliffs as if trying to climb inland, lightning that split trees like paper. From the depths of the ocean, the 15 shadows rose, their forms grotesque and inhuman, limbs twisting, faces screaming silently. The girl walked among them, calling them forward with gestures that mimicked human command but carried the authority of the drowned. Inside the lighthouse, the jar quivered, black wax fissuring as though alive. The echoes of the past guardians whispered in the air, urging caution, warning of the cost. But no living soul was there to heed them. The glass shattered, the fragments slicing through the stagnant air, and the 16th Shadow emerged fully, dripping brine, eyes ablaze with hunger and memory. It moved with precision, sweeping through the lantern room, seeking the mark of the last guardian. Though Elias was gone, his presence lingered, tethered to the jar, a phantom guardian's echo. The shadow recognized it, and rage twisted its form. It screamed, and the sound was not sound but a pressure that pushed through the lighthouse walls, shaking stone and glass alike. The wave responded violently, climbing the cliffside, battering the lighthouse as though the ocean itself had become a living battering ram. Timber splintered, metal groaned, and the glass of the lantern shattered in a cascade of cutting rain. The shadows moved with purpose, circling the ruin, searching, feeding on the lingering life essence that still clung to the building. And somewhere far from the lighthouse, unseen hands stirred the sand. A traveler walking the desolate coast noticed the jar, half buried and shining faintly under the stormlight. Curious, he reached for it, unaware of the debt it carried, unaware of the centuries of blood and sacrifice bound within. The moment his fingers brushed the blackened wax, a ripple surged through the ocean. The shadows below the waves sensed it instantly. The girl reappeared, rising from the sea like a tide made flesh, guiding them toward the lighthouse. The storm intensified, winds bending the cliffs, water cascading over stones with the force of a waterfall turned predator. Inside, the jar exploded, black light flaring into the room, carrying screams and echoes of the drowned. The 16th Shadow coalesced fully. A shape that was neither fully human nor entirely spectral. Towering, dripping. Its presence a command over sea and storm. It moved to the edge of the lighthouse's collapsed stairs, looking down at the approaching humans. The ocean rose behind it, forming grotesque shapes of the drowned town. Buildings and streets distorted into shapes of despair and rage. The shadows began to converge, their forms twisting and elongating, melding with the water itself. The storm's eye seemed to center on the lighthouse. The sea's fury and the sky's wrath focused entirely on the small stone tower perched above the cliff. And there, standing on the edge of the storm, waiting for the inevitable, the 16th Shadow prepared to claim its next victim. The curse had awakened fully now. The cycle would repeat, for the sea remembered, and Harrow's Point would never truly rest. The traveler's fingers froze on the blackened wax. A cold tremor ran through him, as if the sea itself had reached inside his chest. Behind him, the wind howled with a voice like bones breaking, and the waves churned into monstrous shapes, towering above the cliffs. The stormlight revealed a girl standing on the shore, her hair plastered to her face, eyes hollow voids reflecting the roiling sea. She raised a hand, and the water obeyed, climbing the rocks like molten glass. Instinct screamed at him to flee, but something compelled him forward, curiosity tethered to dread. The jar pulsed under his fingers, alive, thrumming with the rhythm of 1,000 drowned hearts. He felt it in his veins, a pull he could not resist. He opened it. Instantly, the storm flared. The lighthouse shuddered violently, timbers cracking, stones splintering under the force of the rising water. 15 shadows surged from beneath the waves, grotesque forms of twisted humanity, faces contorted in silent anguish. They swept toward the shore, coalescing around the girl. The 16th Shadow fully formed, dripping brine and malice, eyes fixed on the traveler's trembling hands. The traveler stumbled backward, the jar falling and shattering against the wet stone. Black wax and salt water spattered his clothes and skin. From it, a torrent of light and shadow erupted, filling the air with whispers. Elias's voice, fragmented, calling warnings he could barely comprehend. The debt. The debt. The 16th Shadow rose, towering dripping seawater that hissed on the stone. Its form was fluid, half-melted, flickering between human and something else entirely. Its hollow gaze fixed on the traveler, who suddenly understood the cost he had summoned. The shadows behind it advanced, moving like a tide, encircling him, crushing every avenue of escape. Panic turned to resolve. In that instant, a memory flashed in the traveler's mind. An image of Elias, of the lighthouse, of the sacrifice made centuries before. The Guardians had contained this for generations, and now it fell to someone new. Without knowing why, without fully understanding, he picked up a shard of black wax still glowing faintly and pressed it into his palm. The warmth burned, searing through skin and bone, a warning that the price was not light. The 16th Shadow lunged, a wave of black water and jagged teeth, its screams silent but deafening in his mind. He shouted the first word that came to him, something ancient, something instinctive, and the wax flared, binding him, linking him to the jar, to Elias, to the Guardians before him. Pain tore through him, vision twisting, and for a moment he saw Harrow's Point as it had been, alive, streets bustling, the lighthouse's light cutting through night and fog. Then he was back, on the stone floor of the ruined tower, water swirling around him, the 16th Shadow recoiling. The shadows hesitated. The girl paused. He could feel their awareness, the predator's intelligence scanning him, sensing a shift, a presence they had not anticipated. His hands ached, the wax burning deep into his veins, but he no longer felt fear. He felt connection. He understood the debt, he understood the price, he understood the cycle. He raised his hands, holding the shard aloft. Shadows shrieked silently, twisting, writhing in fury. The 16th Shadow recoiled, recognition flickering in its hollow eyes. Then, with a force like the ocean itself pressing down, he spoke the words of the lead-bound book, the chants passed down through generations, though none alive had ever heard them. His voice carried through water, through wind, through stone, binding, sealing, demanding repayment. The storm reached its zenith. Lightning struck the cliffs, the beam of the lighthouse flickered and flared. Water surged, then froze, suspended in midair, as the shadows writhed and twisted, drawn toward the shard and the new guardian. With a final scream, a sound of all drowned souls screaming at once, the 16th shadow and the 15 beneath it shattered, torn into fragments that sank like stones beneath the waves. The girl on the shore vanished, leaving only the echoes of her voice carried on the wind. The storm broke, rain tapering to mist, waves calming, leaving only the lighthouse standing against the dawn. The traveler collapsed, gasping, the shard cooled in his palm. He had become the new guardian. Tethered to the light, tethered to the debt, tethered to the sea. He rose, looking out over the calm waters. Harrow's Point remained beneath the waves, silent, its memory preserved in the shadows of the past and the burden he now carried. The lighthouse beam swept the coast, steady, unwavering, a warning and a promise. The curse had been contained, for now. But the cycle would never truly end. And in the reflection of the shard, a face smiled faintly, watching from the past, waiting for the next ripple of curiosity to awaken the 16th shadow once more. The lighthouse stood in silence, a sentinel over a sea that had calmed but never forgiven. The traveler, now the guardian, leaned against the cold stone wall, the shard of black wax still clutched in his hand. He could feel it pulsing faintly, a heartbeat in his veins, a tether to something vast and unyielding. The past guardians whispered in his mind, fragments of memory, moments of fear, courage, and despair. Elias Ward's voice was the clearest, reminding him of the price. The debt must always be paid. Days passed, though time felt irrelevant in the presence of the curse. Each sunrise revealed nothing but the same fog rolling off the cliffs, and the ocean's calm surface hid the horrors beneath. Occasionally he thought he saw shapes in the water, figures twisting in impossible motions, glimpses of the 15 shadows that had returned to their depths. He knew they waited, patient, eternal, sensing the new guardian's touch, their malice coiled like a predator beneath a placid surface. The burden of the jar, now reduced to a shard in his hand, was greater than he could have imagined. Sleep offered no escape, dreams became the domain of the drowned. He saw the streets of Harrow's Point, the people trapped in the eternal flood, faces pressed against invisible barriers, silent mouths opening and closing. He heard their screams in the crashing waves, their pleas in the moaning wind, and though he could not intervene, he understood. Their suffering was bound to him, a constant reminder of what the curse demanded. Then came the nights when the girl returned, not as a form visible to others, but a presence he felt in the shiver of air, the whisper of waves against the cliffs. She circled the lighthouse, an observer, a test. He could feel her judgment, a weight more pressing than the sea itself. She did not speak, yet her intent was clear. She was the 16th shadow reborn, a harbinger of the cycle's persistence, the embodiment of the curse's inexorable will. The guardian tried to endure. He mapped the coastline, studied the tides, recorded the weather patterns, anything that might allow him to anticipate the shadow's return. The jar's shard pulsed with each storm, each violent swell of the sea, warning him of what lay beneath. He learned to chant, to bind, to resist. Each attempt was a battle, each success only temporary. The curse was infinite, and the ocean's memory did not forgive. Years blurred. The townsfolk who remained in nearby villages told stories of the lighthouse that burned at night, though no keeper lived there. Some said a figure stood in the lantern room, silhouetted by the faint beam, eyes reflecting something otherworldly. Sailors avoided the coast, their minds haunted by glimpses of shapes moving beneath the water, shadows that did not belong to fish or tide. And always, the wind carried a faint melody, a song neither human nor fully spectral, echoing the girl's silent lament. The guardian realized the truth. He was not merely a keeper of the shard. He was bound to the curse itself, a living tether to the 16th shadow and the 15 beneath the waves. He would age, decay, perhaps die, but the bond would endure. He was the vessel, the prison, the warning. The shadows would never fully disappear, and Harrow's Point would always sleep beneath the sea, remembered only by the eyes of the cursed and the vigilant. One night, during a storm that mirrored the one of his initiation, the shard flared violently. The girl's presence manifested fully, stepping from the waves like a tide made flesh. She spoke for the first time, her voice a whisper that carried over wind and rain. "You cannot end this," she said. "Only contain it, only endure." The guardian nodded, understanding at last. The cycle would continue. The shadows would wait, the ocean would remember, and someday, another hand would find a shard, and curiosity would awaken the 16th shadow again. The cost was eternal vigilance, a life suspended between land and sea, living on borrowed time, tethered to a darkness that would never relent. He raised the shard to the lighthouse light, chanting the binding once more, and the shadows recoiled into the ocean. The girl vanished into the storm, leaving him alone with the wind and the waves. In the reflection of the shard, he saw Elias Ward, faint and approving, a reminder that sacrifice was the only shield against oblivion. The lighthouse beam swept across the horizon, cutting through fog and night, a warning to the unwary. Harrow's Point remained beneath the waves, silent, but remembered. The curse had been contained once more, though never ended. The guardian understood his fate, he would endure, a sentinel against the shadows, until the sea claimed him too, or until another hand reached for the black wax, and far beyond the cliffs, where the horizon met the sky, the 16th shadow waited, patient and eternal, knowing the cycle would repeat, knowing the sea's memory was infinite, and that curiosity would never be satisfied. The ocean whispered its approval, and the lighthouse continued to shine, a solitary promise amidst the ceaseless, haunting tide. Long before the traveler became the new guardian, 15 others had walked this lonely path. Their names were mostly lost, their stories fragmented like driftwood in the sea. Some were fishermen, drawn to the coast by fate. Others were scholars or wanderers, unaware of the forces they would confront. Each had believed themselves prepared, each had thought their courage enough. Each had failed. One guardian, centuries ago, had been a young woman who sought to map the tides and storms, believing knowledge could contain the sea's wrath. She had failed, leaving her body entwined with kelp beneath the waves, her voice joining the chorus of the drowned. Another had been a man of faith, chanting prayers and invoking blessings, certain divine protection could hold the shadows. Yet he had been consumed, his screams recorded in the echoing chambers beneath the lighthouse. Some had tried violence, others trickery, but the curse did not respond to mortal cunning or ambition. It demanded sacrifice, vigilance, and the humility to endure what could not be changed. The traveler now understood that he was part of that lineage. Each past guardian had left a trace, a fragment of memory, a warning embedded in the shard now burning in his hand. He could feel their fear and their courage, their failures and brief victories. They spoke to him in moments of quiet, whispers in the wind, ripples in the water, dreams that bled into wakefulness. The weight of centuries pressed on him, heavier than stone, colder than the ocean at midnight. The lighthouse itself bore scars of their struggles. Timbers warped by storms that no natural tempest could have produced, stones cracked under invisible forces, rusted metal etched with cryptic symbols from those who had tried to bind the shadows with ink and iron. He explored every corner, every ruined sty. And with each step, he sensed echoes of the past, hands that had grasped the same walls, eyes that had stared into the same storm, hearts that had beaten with dread and resolve alike. Nights became his worst torment. Shadows, faint but insistent, appeared in the corners of the lantern room, stretching into forms human and not, moving beneath the surface of the water outside, and in the reflection of the shard. He could hear them whispering, teasing, warning him that vigilance was not merely physical but spiritual. To falter even briefly was to invite the 16th shadow fully, to allow it dominion over both land and sea. Time distorted. Days bled into nights, months into years. The guardian aged, yet the curse tethered him beyond normal mortal endurance. Hunger and thirst persisted, yet his body seemed to function beyond its natural limits, sustained by some spectral will. Every storm, every lightning strike, every swell of water became a test, a reminder that the ocean never forgot. He learned to live with the constant presence of the 16th shadow. Though it did not appear fully again, he could sense it, lurking beneath the water, waiting for curiosity or error to break the fragile seals of his vigilance. Its patience was infinite. It was a predator older than the town, older than the cliffs, older than memory itself. It was waiting for the day when the shard would falter, when human weakness would offer an opening. The shard in his hand became both a weapon and a prison. He could manipulate it to bind shadows, but only at a cost. Every use drew on his own vitality, linking him ever closer to the curse. Each act of binding left fragments of the previous guardian's despair echoing in his mind. Their warnings mingled with his own pain. He had become a conduit for centuries of sacrifice, a sentinel against a darkness that could not be defeated, only delayed. Even in quiet moments, the echoes haunted him. He could see the streets of Harrow's Point beneath the waves, twisted and alive in the memories of the drowned. Children ran in phantom laughter. Women carried buckets of water that spilled endlessly. Men labored at ships that sank before their eyes. The lighthouse remained a beacon, but it no longer seemed protective. It was a marker of vigilance, a reminder of debt and suffering. The girl, the 16th Shadow reborn, returned at intervals, always silent, always patient, sometimes near, sometimes at the very edge of perception. He never saw her clearly, yet her presence reminded him that the curse was eternal, relentless, and cunning. He learned to listen to the wind for her footsteps, to read the subtle shift in the tide for her approach. Failure meant oblivion, vigilance meant ceaseless torment. Occasionally he encountered outsiders along the cliffs, fishermen or travelers, who dared approach the lighthouse. Each one felt the pull of the curse in subtle ways, a chill in the air, a whisper in the fog, shapes beneath the waves. He warned them, though their disbelief angered the shadows lurking just out of sight. One misstep, one moment of curiosity, and the 16th Shadow could rise again, fully awakened, with the force of centuries of malice behind it. Through it all, he understood the cruel truth: there was no release. The Guardian's role was not temporary. The curse did not age, did not tire, and did not forgive. His life, his mind, and his body were tethered to the shards, the lighthouse, and the ocean. He would endure storms that destroyed cliffs and ships, waves that carried remnants of the drowned town, and shadows that waited beneath the surface, patient and eternal. And far below, Harrow's Point slept beneath the water, its streets filled with the echoes of those who had failed before, waiting for the inevitable. Another hand, another spark of curiosity, another soul drawn into the cycle. The Guardian understood that one day, the 16th Shadow would awaken fully again, that the sea's hunger would rise, and that he would be tested as never before. Yet in the shard's reflection he also saw hope, the faint glimmer of courage and sacrifice that allowed the cycle to continue. For now, the lighthouse beam swept across the horizon, steady and unwavering, warning the world of the darkness beneath. The curse endured, the shadows waited, and he remained, bound to the debt, bound to the sea, and bound to the eternal vigilance required to keep Harrow's Point sleeping beneath the waves. The ocean whispered endlessly, carrying both memory and warning. And the lighthouse shone on, a solitary testament to sacrifice, despair, and the fragile, fleeting victories of those who dared to stand against the tide. The wind rose again, carrying a sharp tang of brine and decay. The lighthouse trembled under the force of the waves, and for the first time in what felt like centuries, the Guardian felt doubt creep through the armor of vigilance he had built around himself. The shard pulsed, a heartbeat out of sync with his own, reminding him that the 16th Shadow lingered just beyond perception, patient, waiting for curiosity or weakness to unravel his control. That night, he wandered the cliffside, each step echoing on wet stone. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, swallowing the horizon, turning the world into a realm of gray shadows and whispered threats. The sea moaned, a low, grinding sound that carried fragments of the drowned town's voices. Children laughing, men shouting orders to invisible crews, women calling names that had long been forgotten, all blended into a haunting chorus. He paused at the edge of the cliffs, gazing down at the water. Shapes moved beneath the surface, the 15 shadows, still chained to the shard, drifting like phantoms, writhing silently, their anguish and fury vibrating in his chest. Then, from the mist, the girl emerged. Her hair was plastered to her face, her eyes hollow voids reflecting nothing but dark water. She raised her hand, and the waves lifted in obedience, curling toward the cliffs like living glass. The shard flared in his hand. He raised it above his head, chanting the ancient binding words, the syllables rasping past his lips like smoke. Pain shot through him as fragments of past guardians pressed into his mind, their fear, their despair, their fleeting courage. He fell to his knees, the shard burning deep into his flesh, yet he endured. He had no choice. To falter was to invite oblivion. The girl's form shifted, flickering between human and something far older, something elemental. Her voice finally broke the silence, a whisper that wrapped around his mind like seaweed. You are not eternal, you are fragile, you are mortal. One day you will fail, and the tide will rise. He gritted his teeth, answering without words, letting the shard's power surge through him. Shadows recoiled, water churned violently, and the girl's laughter, silent yet deafening, echoed in his skull. The shard pulsed, tethering him to the lighthouse, to the ocean, and to the cycle of guardians before him. Pain flared, then subsided, leaving him gasping and trembling, yet still upright, still resisting. The storm raged on for hours, a symphony of wrath and malice. Lightning struck the cliffs, illuminating the ruins of Harrow's Point beneath the waves. Ghostly remnants of houses, streets, and people shimmered briefly before vanishing back into the deep. The Guardian could see their faces now, frozen in terror, longing, despair. He understood that these were echoes, fragments of lives claimed by the curse, yet forever bound to the ocean and the shadows. As dawn approached, the storm began to ease. The girl receded, fading into mist, leaving only the memory of her presence and the promise of return. The sea settled, calm and deceptive. The shard cooled in his hand, though the weight of centuries of sacrifice still pressed upon his soul. He looked out across the horizon, the lighthouse beam slicing through the fog, a solly Terry warning to the world that darkness lingered beneath the waves. Alone, he wandered the lighthouse rooms, tracing the scars left by past guardians. Each mark, each symbol etched into stone or timber, told a story of struggle, endurance, and failure. He spoke aloud, reciting the names and deeds of those who had come before him, preserving their memory as both tribute and warning. The past and present merged, a continuum of vigilance and torment. Time lost all meaning. He felt years pass in moments, centuries in nights. Sleep offered no respite. Dreams became a realm where the drowned and the shadows reached for him, testing his resolve, reminding him that the curse did not forgive, and the ocean never forgot. He learned to endure visions of the past guardians' deaths, the young woman drowned in kelp, the scholar devoured by his own ambition, the man of faith screaming silently beneath waves that would never relent. Their pain was now his own. The 16th Shadow remained a constant presence, waiting in the depths, patient beyond comprehension. He knew that one day, curiosity or misstep would awaken it fully, that the tide would rise and that he would be tested beyond the limits of human endurance. The shard, the lighthouse, the cycle, they were eternal. The Guardian understood that his life, his mind, and his very soul were no longer entirely his own. Yet, in the shard's reflection, he saw something more than torment. He saw courage, fleeting yet enduring. He saw the faint glimmer of hope that allowed the cycle to continue, the spark that prevented the shadows from claiming all. For now, he could hold the darkness at bay. He could honor the sacrifices of those who had come before, and in doing so, he preserved a fragile balance between land, sea, and shadow. And so the lighthouse continued to shine, its beam cutting through fog and night, a sentinel against the deep. Harrow's Point slept beneath the waves, its memory preserved in whispers and reflections, waiting for the inevitable, patient for the next hand that would reach for the black wax. The Guardian remained, bound to the debt, bound to the sea, and bound to vigilance that would never end. The ocean whispered its approval, and the wind carried the faint eternal melody of the 16th Shadow, reminding the world of what lay beneath, reminding the Guardian of his purpose, and reminding all who dared approach that some darkness is endless, some curses are eternal, and some debts can never truly be repaid. Years, decades, centuries, time no longer bore meaning in the lighthouse. The Guardian moved through the rooms like a shadow himself, his body and mind stretched thin by vigilance, yet impossibly sustained by the shard pulsing in his hand. The ocean outside remained calm at times, violent at others, but its memory never wavered. Harrow's Point lay beneath the waves, silent to the world, yet alive in every whispered sigh, every ripple across the tide, every shadow that lingered just beyond perception. Visitors still came occasionally, fishermen, travelers, or the curious who ignored the warnings carried by old tales. They saw the lighthouse standing tall, alone on the cliffs, its light sweeping across the water like a blade of warning. Few approached closely, but the stories of those who had felt the pull of something unnatural, of a chill not carried by the wind but by something older, endured. Those who lingered too long often vanished, swallowed by mist or tide, leaving only faint echoes behind. The girl, the 16th Shadow, returned in fleeting moments, sometimes visible, often only felt. Her presence was a reminder of what was patient, infinite, and inevitable. She did not attack, did not speak except in whispers that wrapped around the Guardian's mind, yet her silence carried more threat than any words. She was both the curse and the witness, the measure of his endurance. One day, she would rise fully, and the cycle would begin anew. And yet, there were omens of strange clarity. When the wind was still and the sea calm, the Guardian could feel the faint presence of past guardians, whispering encouragement, warning, guiding. In the shard's reflection, he sometimes saw fleeting glimpses of them, hands reaching out, faces twisted in terror, eyes filled with hope and despair. He understood that he carried them with him, their experiences woven into his own. Their sacrifices were his armor, their courage his tether to the world above the waves. The lighthouse became more than a structure. It was a symbol, a sentinel against time and tide. Its walls remembered every footstep, every whispered prayer, every scream of those who had tried and failed. The spiral staircase wound endlessly upward, carrying him to the lantern room where the shard glowed faintly, tethering him to the cycle of shadows, guardians, and sacrifices. He learned to endure the whispers, the visions, the relentless presence of the 16th Shadow. Pain became a companion, fear a constant visitor, and isolation a familiar friend. Yet he persisted, for if he faltered even for a moment, the curse would awaken fully, and the sea would rise to reclaim Harrow's Point with all its drowned memories, its horrors and its shadows. At night, the ocean sang, a song older than the town, older than humanity, a melody that carried the voices of the drowned, the warnings of past guardians, and the patient patience of the 16th Shadow. He could no longer tell if he was alive or a part of the curse itself. Perhaps he had become one with it, a living tether anchoring the shadows beneath the waves. Perhaps he had become the new legend, a ghost among ghosts, a sentinel for eternity. And somewhere beyond the horizon, in the silent depths of the ocean, the 16th Shadow waited, patient, eternal, knowing the cycle would repeat. One day, another hand would reach for the black wax, another curiosity would awaken the darkness, and the tide would rise again. Until that day, the lighthouse shone, cutting through fog and night, a solitary promise, a warning, and a testament to the fragile, enduring courage of those bound to resist the infinite. The Guardian remained, tethered to the shard, to the lighthouse, to the sea, and to the eternal vigilance required to keep Harrow's Point sleeping beneath the waves. He was alone, yet never truly alone. The past, the shadows, and the 16th presence were his constant companions. His life, his mind, and his body were no longer fully his own. But in that sacrifice lay the balance that kept the darkness at bay. The sea whispered endlessly, the wind carried faint chilling melodies, and the lighthouse, steadfast and eternal, continued to shine, a solitary light in a world where some darkness is endless, some curses are eternal, and some debts can never truly be repaid. The shard pulsed one last time as the Guardian stood at the lantern room's edge, the wind tearing at his coat, the waves crashing below like furious drums. For a moment he imagined release, an end to the endless watch. But he knew it was an illusion. The 16th Shadow would never be banished. It would always wait, always linger, patient as the tide itself. He lowered the shard, its light dimming in rhythm with his heartbeat. The lighthouse groaned in response to the storm, a sound like the long sigh of the centuries it had witnessed. Below, Harrow's Point slept beneath the waves, silent yet alive in memory, in sorrow, in the endless cycle of sacrifice. The girl, neither fully present nor absent, appeared one last time, her hollow eyes meeting his. She did not speak. She did not move. She simply watched, a mirror of inevitability. And he understood. The cycle was eternal. The tide would rise, the shadows would stir, and the lighthouse would shine again for the next hand that reached too far. With a steadying breath, he turned from the edge, feeling the weight of countless guardians pressing into him, their courage, their despair, their fleeting victories. The shard rested in his palm, warm and alive, tethering him to the duty that had become his existence. The storm began to subside, the waves slowed, the fog lifted just enough to glimpse the horizon, endless and gray. He knew that tomorrow the cycle would continue, the shadows would wait, and Harrow's Point would remain hidden beneath the restless sea. He was alone, yet never truly alone. Bound by duty, tethered to the curse, and sustained by the courage of those who had come before. He was the sentinel against the darkness, and though the 16th Shadow lingered, patient and eternal, he would endure, for there was no other choice. The lighthouse beam swept across the horizon one final time, cutting through the mist, a solitary warning to the world. The curse remained. The shadows waited, and the guardian, forever vigilant, stood resolute, a solitary light against an endless night. The ocean whispered. The wind carried its warning. And somewhere deep beneath the waves, the 16th Shadow smiled, patient, eternal, and waiting. The curse was unbroken. The vigil continued. And the world remained, for now, unaware of the darkness that slept beneath the tide. The wind finally stilled, and the waves, though restless, no longer struck the cliffs with fury. The lighthouse stood alone against the gray horizon, its beam cutting a steady path across the water. The guardian lowered the shard, feeling the weight of centuries of sacrifice settle into his bones. He understood now that there would be no release, no end to the watch, no moment when the 16th Shadow could be banished. It was patient, eternal, waiting beneath the tides, in the mist, in the shadows. He looked out at the drowned town below, Harrow's Point sleeping beneath the waves, its streets and houses ghostly in memory but alive in echoes. The faces of those who had come before him flickered in the shard's glow. The young woman, the scholar, the man of faith, all part of him now, all bound together by the endless cycle. He felt their courage and despair, their fear and fleeting hope, and he drew strength from it. The girl appeared one last time, a silent presence at the edge of perception. Her hollow eyes met his, unblinking, unmoving, yet her gaze carried the inevitability of what would come. He did not flinch. He did not move. He understood the truth. The 16th Shadow would always wait, always test, and the vigil must continue. The guardian turned back to the lighthouse, to the rooms that held the marks of all who had come before, to the staircase winding endlessly upward, to the lantern room where the shard pulsed with quiet light. He raised the shard once more, feeling its warmth, its tether to the curse, and to the ocean that never forgot. And then he stood in silence. The storm had passed. The tide was calm. The fog had lifted. Harrow's Point slept beneath the waves. The 16th Shadow waited, patient and eternal. The lighthouse beams swept across the horizon one final time. The curse endured. The shadows lingered. The guardian remained. And though the world above would forget, and time would continue unheeding, he knew that as long as he lived, as long as the shard pulsed in his hand, the darkness would never fully rise. The vigil continued, always. And in that endless watch, the story of Harrow's Point, of the Guardians, and of the 16th Shadow finally found its resting place. Not in freedom, not in triumph, but in enduring, unbroken vigilance. The night settled, the sea whispered, and the lighthouse shone eternal.